Thank you for the kind words, Guyton. And it is returned in kind. Appreciate the work that you do, and always glad to be able to assist in whatever way that I can. I was sitting there thinking a moment ago as Brother Victor was preaching, and knowing the topic he had versus the topic I had, I thought, well, there are dogs that can hunt and that do hunt, and I've never owned one of those. There are sermons that'll preach, and I've developed very few of those. And there's preachers who can preach, and unfortunately I had to follow one. So I hope that what we have to say tonight is going to be at least part of a sermon that will preach from a very mediocre source. The 30 Years' War. When Guyton first assigned me that, I thought I hadn't even been married that long. So I don't know much about that subject. She's with me tonight, so don't think you have to tell her. And anytime I say something, if I want her to know, I'll tell her. Two things before we get into the lesson proper. Two things that you need to understand, think about as we get into the lesson. In the outline book, there is a definition for the term religion. I find it very interesting, the way it is defined, and it tells a lot about society and the people that you are around every day and even yourself. This particular definition is outlined in the book, just the cultural system of designated behaviors and practices, morals, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics, or organizations that relate humanity to supernatural, transcendental, or spiritual elements. The key in all of that is it relates humanity to. So whatever the religious practice is, and you'll note in the outline book there are over 10,000 distinct recognized religions, which means there are over 10,000 different ways, just by the religious definition alone, that men relate to what they see as deity. Now that explains a lot in the behavior around you. Because however a person acts, you can begin to understand what they worship. You can begin to understand what it is they believe. Because whatever it is that they see as the supernatural, as the transcendental, or as the spiritual element to their makeup, they are going to resemble that. So it's no wonder that a few people would take control of some airplanes and fly them into 2 tall buildings, because what they do represents the deity in their mind that they have shaped, and they are going to purport that in their life. But you can go into a church of Christ on Sunday morning, and you can also see what people believe too. And not every one of them believe this. So with 10,000 different religions, understand that that religion is going to be born out in the life of that individual. They are going to assimilate themselves to whatever deity it is that they serve. And by deity, I don't mean there's more than one. It's just what they recognize as the spiritual entity that they serve. Number 2 tonight, understand that with every religion, there are those who hijack it. There are those who pervert it. There are those who misunderstand it. And so you begin looking through the Bible, and you begin to see individuals who were religious people. You don't look far into the text of Scripture before you come to Genesis 4. Cain was a religious person. You say, wait a minute, didn't he murder his brother? Yes, he did. But where did that activity begin? It began when he came to an altar with a sacrifice. He was a religious person. But his religion, the way he practiced it and the way that he focused on the God of heaven that had called him to bring that sacrifice, was quite a bit different than was Abel's understanding. And so here is a religious man who, after having a religion that was not acceptable to Jehovah, he kills his brother. Very early in the existence of mankind, religion has been turned into something very violent. You can look at all of the other examples that we mention in the book, and there's a lot of others through the Bible, where people have, in the name of religion, and that, when you talk about from the Bible, you're looking at those who followed religion as it was under the law of Moses, or even some who would purport Christianity. In the New Testament, you find men like Caiaphas, a high priest. Now, he is the religious leader of the Jews. And in John chapter 7, in verse number 49, really verse number 50, he says, "It is expedient that one man die, than a whole nation perish." Think about it. This is a religious man who is espousing that it is better for Jesus to die. He's ready to kill Jesus in the name of religion in order that the whole nation of Israel not fall pummeled by Rome. You take a man like Saul, prior to obeying the gospel, and you know he had a good conscience, and what he did in holding the coats of those that stoned Stephen, meaning he had the authority in the matter, he was the leader at that event, he sanctioned the stoning of Stephen in the name of religion. A misunderstanding of what that religion was and where it was leading, that he later figured out and was taught by Ananias. But two things that you have to understand at the outset that we're trying to establish to really make some application of our topic tonight. What is religion? And that's what shapes men. So when you look at the 30 Years' War and other events surrounding it, understand the religion that they practiced was going to allow for that. Number two, understand that sometimes people pervert religion. And there are going to be those who will use violence and other efforts, acts of war even, in the name of religion. So tonight what we want to do, understanding that, we want to look at what led up to the 30-Year War. Because really when you study Reformation history, while there is one war that's referenced in the 30-Year War that primarily was in the area of land that's presently known as Germany, you have a lot of other things going on too. You got a lot of other battles that are being fought. And so a prelude to a war is what we'll call it. What led to this war that we're really looking at tonight? And then what were the causes, initial causes, and the sparks that set off the powder keg of the 30-Year War? But then we really want to evaluate and look. We are studying religious history, but we would fail in our efforts tonight if we didn't make some kind of application to you and I in the spiritual kingdom of the Lord. In any study of history, we're trying to learn from the mistakes of those of the past, but also be encouraged by the positives of those people in the past. And so tonight we have those three planned purposes that we want to accomplish. Number one, think about that which set the precedent for war. What is it that leads men to act in such a way? Well, last year, I think it was Brother Ronnie Whittemore that spoke on the Crusades. Very violent and atrocious activities that were carried out in that time period of history. And some of them leading right up to the time period of history that we're looking at in this lectureship. On the heels of the Crusades, you had something known as the Inquisition. Now, the inquisitors of the Inquisition weren't merely asking questions. They were actually really just trying to get you to admit that you were opposing the Catholic Church. They're just trying to make you plead guilty so they can then torture you and kill you. And the sooner you admit it, perhaps the quicker you can get the death over with. But even then, if you hold out and you say, "I'm not guilty," they may torture you and even put you to death. We mentioned one, a Dominican in the text of the book, who in one day killed over 180 people. And we mentioned some of the things. I would, of course, be careful if you were to do a Google search or some kind of online search of the Inquisition and the manners of torture. Be careful with that. But you won't be surprised at some of the things that you find, perhaps, in the torturous ways that men were killed. Very violent ways that men were tortured and put to death. And so the Inquisition is something that is a prelude to the violent atrocities of the 30-Year War. Within the Reformation movement, I'm not sure how much Zwingli and Luther was, as far as their activities were mentioned relative to an alliance, but there was an attempted alliance. Of course, Zwingli and Luther couldn't come to terms on transubstantiation. And so they didn't end up joining an alliance, but Luther and Zwingli were in a preparation of joining so that they could create a military resistance or defense to Roman Catholic Church. You also have the cantons of Switzerland, a civil war, and I guess it'd be what you call counties or even states. A state divided up into counties, that would be the cantons of Switzerland. Perhaps states would be better, to where all the states of the nation are fighting. And among these states, there are some that are Protestant, some that are Roman Catholic, and they are warring and they are fighting. And Zwingli ends up dying in one of those, or in a part of one of those. But then you have the Cologne Wars. And the reason we mention the Cologne Wars in 1583 to 1588, because of the success of the Catholic Church. In your book, you'll find an explanation of what was going on, where you have a man that converts to Protestantism, and that creates a problem, and so it leads to his being ostracized. He's excommunicated. He goes to war, but the Catholic Church wins in those Cologne Wars. The Holy Roman Empire wins, which Voltaire later said was neither holy or whatever. It wasn't holy and it wasn't an empire or something. I forget what he said about it now, but it's in the book somewhere there. I included it. But they won those Cologne Wars. And to them, it was a new way to deal with putting down the Protestant Reformation. And because of that, it's kind of like when you talk about sharks and blood in the water. When the Cologne Wars ended in 1588, there was a lot of blood in the water. And Roman Catholicism was going to work diligently now in that vicious and violent way to stop any and all reform, Protestant reform. 30 Years' War then. A little about the war as far as the years, 1618 to 1648. Estimated 8 million casualties in that 30 years. Not all of those from the action of military troops. Some of it was from disease and famine that goes along with it. Some have asserted that more than 1/3 of the people of the German states died as a result of that war. So you can see it was a rather significant event in Germany, or at least the area of Germany that we know as Germany. It involved political as well as economic struggle. It began as a religious war. It began as an attempt to put down Protestantism or to establish Protestantism, depending on which side you were on. But it evolved into something that was political and something that was economic, because as you see the war taking place, it ends up being a battle for control over land. Some of those that get into the war, like the Netherlands or even the Spaniards, they're only trying to advance their own territory or expand their power and authority. And so you can see where a religious pursuit was overcome with economic and political pursuits as well. So when it comes to the 30 Years' War, that's kind of just some general information. What started it? Maybe this is the information that Guyton was looking for. And there's a couple funny things that do happen that sparked this war. But before we get to the funny thing, realize that there was great moral and political decay. There's never been a nation that has been allowed to stand, or that has been able to stand, when moral and political decay run rampant. And especially morality. And within the nation of the Holy Roman Empire, or within the Holy Roman Empire, there was a lot of decay. There was a lot of immorality. And so, no doubt, that's going to be a precursor. Decay was evidenced by the weak imperial power, but it always precipitates war. If we might make a point of application here, in the church too, we haven't got to the spiritual army of God yet. We haven't reached that point, but we can make this in our nation, but more particularly to the church. Because in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 3, there is a problem that develops in the church where there are splintered factions, warring factions, fighting groups. And you know what Paul said the problem was? They were carnal. They were worldly. Their mind was focused on the flesh. And when men are carnal, there is envy, strife, and division. And so when morality is let loose and immorality reigns, there's always going to be problems. People do say, well, you can't legislate morality. Well, it depends on how you're arguing that. Our government has every right to impose the laws of God for righteous behavior. You know why? Because they only exist because God gives them that right to exist, Romans 13. God has the ultimate authority, and the rising and falling of nations is in His hand. And the righteous commandments of God are always right, no matter what decade you live in, no matter what year you live in. Amen. And so when you look to the idea of legislating morality, our government has every right to declare that abortion is an immorality that we will not tolerate, nor should we. And when it comes to the matter of homosexuality, immorality, our government has a right in that too. Now here's where you cannot legislate morality. You can't make the heart of the individual accept God's standard. So you can make laws all you want to. That doesn't necessarily change the heart, the mind of those who are supposed to follow those laws. But the Bible assures us that when immorality reigns, there is going to be envy, strife, and division. So if we're talking about a 30-year war that led to 8 million casualties, where people are constantly killing one another, you know what I know is present? Immorality. James chapter 4, he simply said, whence come wars and fightings among you? This prevailing idea of war, and then the individual battles that are in there. Where does that come from? It comes from the lust that war in your members. So, what started the 30-year war? Ultimately, you can assign a problem of moral decay. And the same will happen in our nation. The same will happen in the church if we allow moral decay to continue. More specific to the problem that created the 30-year war, you had a king by the name of Ferdinand II, a Bohemian king, which is modern-day Czech Republic if you're looking at a map of today's life. I was thankful that when Guyton gave me this assignment, I had a daughter who's a freshman in high school taking world history. And I also had an older daughter as a freshman in college who was taking world history, because two of the best sources that I had were their history books. I'm just glad I didn't have to pay for those history books. But the idea of the King of Bohemia, Ferdinand II, was to implement a Roman Catholic absolutism. That is, everybody in my reign, in my kingdom, is going to be Roman Catholic. Well, that violated the Peace of Augsburg. that allowed the rulers of the individual sections of Bohemia to decide what they wanted. Well, this same man became the emperor of that Roman Empire. And so not only is he making this a matter in Bohemia, but he's trying to force it on all of Europe. And that's a problem. He sends some men to Prague. And this is kind of the funny thing to me. It's an event called the Defenestration of Prague. And you have to know that fenestration just means the windows and the doors. And I tell you, I've known a few of my brethren who might have needed to be thrown out the window. But in this case, you've got 3 men at least that are ambassadors of Ferdinand. And when they come to the castle at Prague, those who are in there take them and throw them out. And that's really the shot heard around the world as far as the 30-Year War. That's what set it off, the powder keg that really got it going. Now, as far as the extent of the war, it's going to go on down through 1648. You're going to have a lot of players, we mentioned in Bohemia where it began, that was going to be a 5-year struggle for Ferdinand that he would be involved in to just quell the Protestant movement. But then you're going to have the Spanish army entering with the Catholic League against the forces of Protestantism. You're going to have Christian IV, the king of Denmark and Norway, getting in. You're going to have the Swedes joining the war in 1630 with Gustavus Adolphus in support of the northern Protestants. And by this time, all of these people getting involved are just seeing economic advancement. They're going to use this war in order to develop their own selves, to increase their own power and increase their own economic standing. And so while there was a religious aspect to the 30-Year War, there's also a political aspect to the war and the economic aspect. That's kind of the 30-Year War in a nutshell. I don't think we need to go through all the battle plans and all the battles that were fought. And the main reason for that is I don't know all of them. Guyton's right. It's hard to find some of that information. And so what we have in the book is about what I could gather. And there's probably better sources out there. There's probably other things that would help us understand the extent of the war as it went through basically all of Germany, but affected the whole European continent because so many were involved in it. The last notable battle was in 1648 when the Swedes attacked Prague. They did capture the castle where it all began, but they weren't really able to infiltrate and take the whole city. And so a peace was struck. And what ended the 30-Year War was called the Peace of Westphalia, effectively ending that long war, but it sparked a number of treaties between all of the players. So the 30-Year War wasn't just a solid 30 year wars of two sides fighting, but it was multiple places, multiple people just jumping in and out of the war, and then all of the treaties that came after the Treaty of Westphalia, as all of these little entities and large entities are making peace with one another. The result, really the result of all of that, was an established, kind of like what the Peace of Augsburg had done back in the 1500s. It allowed each ruler to decide the religion of their province. So if Germany is divided into 360 independent states, as we mentioned in the book, then each of those 360 independent states gets to decide what their religion is going to be, particularly either Lutheran or Calvinism or Catholicism. We also note that the ancient notion of the Roman Catholic Empire of Europe, spiritually headed by the Pope and temporarily by the emperor, was permanently abandoned. After the 30-Year War, this locked control of the European continent by Roman Catholicism had pretty much ended. And what that did, it allowed for the entrance of so much other thoughts. Really, in that last part of Roman numeral 2, letter D, number 5, notice the 30-year war greatly weakened and in some cases even broke the stranglehold of Catholicism, but it allowed Calvinism, Lutheranism, and other isms to begin to flourish. You say, what did that mean? What does that have to do with anything? Well, that allows for independent thought. And that is also going to be the very thing that will spark the restoration. Because as all of these isms begin to jump up, man is not unified in any one thought, and they're looking for unifying teaching. They're looking for something to unite behind. And so really the 30-year war, it basically set up the European boundaries as we know them today. It allowed for the control of Roman Catholicism to be broken. And it allowed all of the thinking of man to go forward, developing various and manifold denominations of belief, which then in turn is going to lead men to desire a unified structure, going back to the New Testament church. So was the 30 Years' War a vital part of history? Yeah, it really was. Because it even plays a role. You know, small events in life make a difference in so many ways that we may never even know. I've been married for 22 years. I had to make sure. You know, the reason I've been married for 22 years and have two beautiful daughters that I have is because several years ago in 1993, my sister, older sister, worked at a little car hop joint called K&N in Martin, Tennessee. Still there. If you're ever passing through Martin, go to K&N, root beer, have a frozen mug root beer, have a Texas chili pie, have a number 1 hamburger. They're great. But my sister said, hey, there's a young lady up here you might want to meet. All these years later, that little incident had such an impact in my life. I can only imagine the influence, or the impact really, we should say, of the 30-year war on where we are today. If the events of that don't happen, and Catholicism is able to keep its stranglehold, we may not be where we are today, in this free area, able to teach and preach and worship as we are. But we've got to make some application out of that. We've got to think about how does that apply and what do we learn from that? How do we learn from the history? And here's where we go. Now, we're talking about military physical efforts of men in violent acts one against another. And yet in the Bible there is an understanding that the church is a militant group, a military group. There's a passage in Ephesians 6 in verse 10 through verse 18 that talks about the panoply of God, the armament of God. And so the imagery of a soldier in his battle array would indicate to us that the Lord has an idea that we are an army. But you got to understand the nature of that army. You have to understand the nature of that militant body that the Lord has developed and has brought together on His terms. You think about the words that Paul says to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 4. Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier. Paul calls Timothy a soldier. Was he the only one in the army? Was Timothy the only one who was ever enlisted in the army of Jesus? Of course not. So the Bible gives this analogy that we are soldiers in an army, but not to do what they did in Cologne, not to do what they did throughout Germany in the 1600s, not to do what they did in the Inquisition or the Crusades or any of the other wars that have been fought in the name of religion. We have to understand the nature. The religion that Christ has presented to us, that which assimilates us to the God we serve, that's our religion. What is assimilating us to God is going to dictate the kind of army that we are. So think about the elements of that army in all of its parts. The Scriptures present the church as an army, but the nature of the church is no different than the nature of its captain. In the army, you have the various ranks. In the army of the Lord, captain is the highest rank because He is the captain of our salvation. And so when it comes to the Lord's army, the army is going to be of the same nature as the captain of that army. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul has been speaking to them about his light affliction. He's having to make a defense of his ministry. And as he defends his ministry, demonstrates that he is a true minister of God. He has given forth a list in chapter 4 and chapter 5, or into chapter 5, or the list in chapter 4, of the manifold sufferings that he has endured, the manifold things that he has been afflicted by as a minister that proves or that demonstrates his genuineness as a minister. And as he ends chapter 4, he says, our light affliction, getting beat with rods and getting stoned to death and getting beat with a whip, that's a light affliction. Light affliction. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. In chapter 5 and verse 1, he talks about the earthly house of our tabernacle. This fleshly body, if it were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And as he concludes that section, or is bringing it down to a thought in verse number 7, we walk by faith and not by sight. When you come down then to verse number 16, he says, henceforth know we no man after the flesh. But wait a minute. My father just sat up here beside me a moment ago, led us in the singing. As far as I know, he and I are still in the flesh. I know my father. I know all of you, we're here in the flesh, right? So what's he talking about? We haven't left the flesh. We haven't left this body. He's focused on the way we look at people. Henceforth know we no man after the flesh. What are you looking at with that man? We have known Christ after the flesh. Jesus was in the flesh. Yet now henceforth know we Him no more. How do we know Christ? As a spiritual being. What are we looking at when we look at one another? I know you don't want to look at this ugly mug too much longer, but when you look at me, what do you see? Beyond the gray hair, beyond the goat hair on my chin, beyond the dark eyes and the thick eyebrow. Boy, was I blessed. If I ever lose my hair like he did, I'll just grow them out and comb them back. But what do you see? When you look at those sitting beside you in the pew, what do you see? What you should see is the soul. What you should be considering is the soul of that individual. We don't know Christ after the flesh. We know Him from the standpoint of the spiritual. Our captain is a spiritual captain. Thus, the nature of His army is a spiritual army. And we are focused on the souls of men. So when it comes to battling for the souls of men, physical warfare is not the answer. It's not the way this army fights. And even if it were, it would be impossible with the weaponry He's given us, because He didn't give us carnal weapons. The nature of the army resembles the nature of our captain. It resembles the nature of the armor He's given us. Well, think about that in Ephesians 6. When you take the panoply of God, here's your weaponry. Here's your armament. Here is what you are wearing as a soldier. You're wearing the truth. You're wearing righteousness. You're wearing salvation. You ever killed anybody with salvation? I know in speaking the truth, sometimes it appears like you just killed someone. But the truth is not a carnal weapon. Salvation is not a carnal weapon or weaponry. The breastplate of righteousness, our feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. You know what's in our hand? And one is the shield of faith, and the other is the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. The very nature of the weaponry we have would tell you that the whole concept of physical war and armament is not the plan of the army of God. The nature of our adversary would tell us that we are in a spiritual army, waging a spiritual battle. We're told in Ephesians chapter 6, in verse number 12, that we don't wrestle with flesh and blood. We don't wrestle with flesh and blood, but against principalities and against the rulers of darkness of the world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's our adversaries. That's what we're battling against. We're not battling against physical things. It's a spiritual warfare. And our enemies, we have to see and look at and even wage war on a spiritual level with spiritual armament and spiritual warfare. The nature of the battlefield would tell you that there's a distinct difference in the activities of the 1600s in the 30 Years' War and the kind of battle that we're trying to wage today. You see, when you read in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, not 2 Corinthians chapter 11, but 2 Corinthians chapter, I guess it is chapter 10, rather, he talks about bringing into captivity every thought unto obedience to Christ. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. And the end result is bringing into captivity every thought in our minds, bringing them into captivity under the captain of our salvation. And that's not a physical warfare. The nature of the casualties of our war would tell you that the nature of the warfare is not physical but spiritual. So when we think about the nature of the warfare, we consider the things regarding this army that we're in. I sometimes wonder why even my brethren will go physical on us. I've been in those men's business meetings where men get upset. Fortunately, in the 20 years almost that I've spent at Union Hill, that's never happened. But I have seen brethren desire to come to blows over matters about carpet and parking lot pavement and things like that. That's not our warfare. It's not what we're about. And I've really never understood, knowing the nature of our spiritual warfare, why it's been so intently done by some brethren that we want to destroy people in this world. Why is it that when standing for truth, we think we need to utterly obliterate the lives of other people? Amen. That's not what we're about. Because when I see that other brother, when I see that individual that I am trying to claim as a casualty in the war on the side of good, I'm supposed to see a soul that needs saving, not a person that needs to be destroyed. Sometimes people hijack even the right religion. And in the name of religion, they destroy people. That's not what my Lord's army is about. Because that's not what the captain of my salvation did. He came to seek and save the lost. And every life that came to him was improved. Because every life gained spiritual blessings. Christianity is not to be used for material and political gain. I've seen even in the church those who will utilize Christianity to fatten their own pocketbook. Folks, if that's why you preach, preachers, if that's why you preach to fatten a pocketbook, I need to ask you where you're preaching. Because I don't want to preach there. If you're preaching, if you're teaching, if you're using the church as a means for financial gain, you don't understand the army of my captain. If you're using the church for political gain, and you're making the church a political weapon, you don't know the captain that I serve. We are a spiritual army serving a spiritual captain, fighting with spiritual warfare or spiritual armament and we're battling for the minds of men because their souls are at stake. What happened with the 30-year war, whether it began because of religious reasons, whether it escalated to political and economic reasons, it was wrong. Because that's not what true religion is for. Unfortunately, though, they're not the last people that have hijacked and perverted and misused and misunderstood the religion of my Lord. I hope that's not depicting any of us here. Bear ye one another's burdens, so fulfill the law of Christ. You know what he meant by that in Galatians 6:2? Now, there's a lot of burdens in life that we're to help one another with. You know what the primary burden under consideration there is? Look at verse number 1. If a brother be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. You know what burden is specifically under consideration? Putting that brother who has sinned back in joint in the body of Christ. And that can be a hard and difficult path to have to trudge. So you help him. He didn't say go out and destroy him. Utterly cut off any opportunity to be reattached to the body. That's not what he said. He said you restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. You're not above being lost either. And you're going to need a burden to be borne one day too. So remember the captain you serve. Remember the army of the Lord. Tonight, are you in the Lord's army? Are you in the army of our Savior? He'll be the captain of your salvation. He's called the author and finisher of our faith. And here's the thing about it. If you're not in the Lord's army, you're on the losing side. Amos chapter 4, interesting verse, number 12. Prepare to meet thy God. If you consider the passage as I understand it, it's kind of a military challenge. If you're not going to come back to the Lord, will you prepare to meet Him in battle? Yeah, He's the one that steps on the mountains like they're stepping stones to the front door. He's the omniscient. He's the omnipotent. He is everywhere. You can't flank Him. So you prepare to meet Him. If you're not going to fight on His side, then you're going to be on the losing side. Tonight, are you in the Lord's army? Are you a soldier in His military regime? If you're outside of the church, you're not. Because the church is His militant body. Tonight, you can enlist in His army. But just like any military, I think we have some in the audience tonight who are in the military. I know we have at least one, because I was talking to him about it just a little earlier. You know, he didn't just go one day and say, hey, I'm going to be a part of you. That's not how that works. Now, they go to a lot of extremes to recruit you. But there's a way in which you enlist or you sign up, and you have to do it their way. Well, the Lord's no different. He has an army, but He has an enlistment plan. Tonight, if you're going to enlist in the Lord's army, you have to do it on His terms. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 26 and 27 identifies the means into Him or into His body as baptism. As many of us as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. You haven't been baptized into Him, you're not in His army. If you're not in His army, you're losing. Are you in His army tonight? If you haven't been baptized, you haven't. Now, baptism is the culmination. There's other things in that enlistment process because you can't call on the name of the Lord, which is what Paul did in Acts 22:16 when he obeyed the gospel, was baptized for the remission of his sins. That was calling on the name of the Lord. Well, you couldn't call on Him if you haven't heard. You can't believe on Him if you haven't heard. So there is the necessary hearing. There is the necessary believing on the captain of our salvation. There is the need to repent, to turn from sin before you enter His army. There is the need to acknowledge Him as that captain in His army. You confess Him before men. Then you enter into that watery grave that you can enlist in His army. And when you're in His army, there's going to be battles along the way, but you ultimately win the war. You win Don't you want to do that? Paul told Timothy, endure hardness as a good soldier, that you may please him who hath called you, the one who's enlisted you. Are you pleasing Christ? You're in his army tonight. Are you pleasing your commander? Are you pleasing your captain? Are you what you should be as a soldier of the cross? Tonight, if you're not fighting on the right terms, you're not fighting in the right way, you're using the Lord's army for material, political, or economic gain, whatever it might be, you're fighting for the wrong reason, it's time to change your course. It's time to engage in the right way and for the right purpose. Maybe tonight you need to come back home. We have an invitation song selected. We're prepared to assist you. If you're ready to enlist in the Lord's army, or you're ready to be put back in rank and march according to the Lord's cadence, won't you come back home? As together we stand and as we sing.